Gather around, I'm going to tell you a story. Let's start with this from super attorney Tom Pollock.
In 1971, I became George's attorney. He was just doing THX 1138 with Francis Coppola at Warner Bros., which was an extension of the short he did at USC. The first deal we did was a 2-picture deal at United Artists Corporation for George to write a script called American Graffiti, and for an untitled science fiction movie in 9 parts. Swear to God, this was what was in the contract. I know this because when Skywalker Ranch was built, George had a time capsule buried. One of the things I put in there was that contract, along with the Articles of Incorporation of Lucasfilm.
Tom Pollock would eventually be the man to seal the deal that would allow George Lucas to make billions from the Star Wars franchise. The success of American Graffiti was used as leverage by Pollock to secure the sequel rights for Star Wars to George Lucas, and the success of Star Wars paved the way to renegotiate, which then left George Lucas in possession of the merchandising rights for the Star Wars franchise. In the same year, Pollock and Lucas met. 1971, the New York Times would comment on Richard Nixon's remarks, which he borrowed from Milton Friedman, that he and everyone were now Keynesians. This was, of course, in reference to the abandonment of the Bretton Woods system and the adoption of Keynesian economics.
I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
It was here that the economy became reoriented toward debt collection and debt servicing. It was in this environment that Star Wars would thrive as the blueprint for the ever-optimizing methods of extracting fees from creative works as a service. Star Wars is a story, and a story on its own is inherently free. Once you experience it, it cannot be taken back. There are obviously methods to charge fees to access a story, but Star Wars was in many ways the prototype for optimizing the fee collection on a story, and as a franchise represents 3 distinct eras of this optimization. The original trilogy prototyped optimization of merchandising and licensing. The prequel trilogy prototyped optimization of blockbuster re-releases and reboots. And the sequel trilogy, if you believe it has any merit or not, represented a prototype of the optimization of perpetuating full blockbuster factory media. At each stage of the process of optimization, less and less room exists for the process of creation by an artist. Pollock contends that the original intention in the negotiations over the ownership of Star Wars had everything to do with artistic integrity.
At that point, I was a lawyer, doing what my client wanted. And what my client wanted wasn't the money, it was the ability to get the movie made. What he said was, and you have to remember that George has an innate suspicion of Hollywood studios. The worst thing that can happen to me is that I couldn't make the sequel, or I couldn't do the rest of the series if the first one worked. So you have to make sure that I have the ability to do that. That part fell on me. So instead of taking more money or other things, he used the success of American Graffiti for that. None of this was because he knew that Star Wars was going to be so successful. It was all about, I don't want to not have the ability to make the movies I want to make, and have it get lost in what today is called development hell.
Though George Lucas could not have foreseen the trajectory of the post-1971 economy, his suspicion of the Hollywood studio system gave him an intuition that ultimately allowed him to understand the direction things were going in. He speaks here on the limitations of the Hollywood system when compared to Soviet films.
But I do like movies. I love movies. And I know a lot of movies aren't popular. And you can say that going in. One of the reasons I retired is so I could make movies that aren't popular. Because in the world we live in the system we've created for ourselves in terms of, it's a big industry, you cannot lose money. So the point is that you're forced to make a particular kind of movie. And I used to say this all the time when people, back when Russia was the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And they'd say, oh, but aren't you so glad that you're in America? I said, well, I know a lot of Russian filmmakers. They have a lot more freedom than I have. All they have to do is be careful about criticizing the government. Otherwise, they can do anything they want.
And so what do you have to do?
You have to adhere to a very narrow line of commercialism. And there's only certain, look, when I started in the 70s, it was like this. You know, I could say Russia was like this, but we were like this. You could do a certain kind of movie. And I flaunted that system. I mean, THX, my first film, is definitely not an American film, and I shoved it in sideways. Francis helped me trick the studio.
Yeah, right.
They would have never let me make that movie if they knew what I was doing.
There appears then to be an obvious division between artists working with and for the system and artists working for themselves. Perhaps a way to tell them apart as the system moves towards its own conclusion is to ask not, why should I buy your artwork? But instead, why should I engage with your artwork? Why should I experience it? What is it that you have to say?